Hi everyone and welcome back, BT here. I really hope you enjoyed the fursuit meet and greet panel. Great to see all the furry faces up there. Felt like a real con, didn't it? I'm here at the lounge, a great place to kind of chill, hang out with some friends and socialize, and kind of get that vapor vibe going on. Awesome sunset behind me. I love that vaporwave sunset. I don't know if we can go swimming. Can we go swimming in here? Let's check this out. Oh, yeah, you can. Nope, I guess you can't. You can pick them up, though. I thought I can kind of relax on these, but nope, you can actually pick them up and have a pool toy to play with. It's like ring toss. So coming up next, we're going to have the Introduction to Anatomy, an amazing course to learn, perspective of bone, muscle, movement. So, stick around and look forward to that. And like I said, if you're looking for a nice place to hang out in the con, need a nice little chill vibe, definitely come here to the lounge. Cool music, some awesome art posted up, some great spots to hang out, like the little fire over here. Or, pop up on the couch. Two moons away, 1 moon. Okay. So if you're wondering how to get to this awesome place, there you can definitely jump in through the hotel lobby. There's a few portals there by the in the rooms and the elevators. Don't be afraid to check out the cool rooms out there. There's a couple interesting places, little gems that you can actually find while exploring the hotel. I'm just kind of by and looking at the awesome artwork that's posted. Great way to see some new artists and some neat little talent in our fandom. Hey, you can draw again. Yay. Oh, I don't have... Let me see if I can draw something here. Give me something cool. Okay, let's see. They definitely need something here, so... A little closer here. Yeah, well, this is going to be like my inspiration of a cat on a beach here in my lovely non-VR form. You know what? We can just do the stick figure guy. There we go. Awesome. Original artwork by BT. We'll see how long this sits here for. You can own this piece of lovely artwork for $500. I take Bitcoin, I take Barkcoin, Snuggles, I'm open to suggestions. Oh, that's beautiful. Oh, all proceeds will definitely go to charity for this beautiful piece. You know me, I love giving out to a charity, and they're well deserving of the funds that the con has definitely raised for them. And thank you, everyone who has actually donated to the cause. I know they're doing pretty well. So, as far as I know, they broke the donometer, if I'm not mistaken. So let's see if we can break it again and keep going. I would love to see that. 12,233, I think we're sitting at right now. So good job, everyone. Really happy about that. Hey, if we can get 15, I'll be ecstatic. And look, it's only day one. We still got 2 days to go, so I'm sure we can definitely hit that goal. Ooh. Yeah, I think that looks good with all this awesome collection of artwork. I think I'm looking pretty good there. Maybe should have used a little bit more color, but it's okay. I think they get the point. This is why I'm not a dealer at the dealer stand. But there's some amazing pieces on this wall. It's a great little place to check out. Oh, I wonder if we can... Oh, hey, if you're looking for a great selfie opportunity, perfect right here. You got the hover car, the little DeLoreans going on, with the vaporwave sunset behind you. Look at that. You can be like definitely, you know, posing with your ride right here. Best shot I think of the con right here. Can you? Hold on. I think I can sit in it too. Oh, there we go. Ha ha ha. See, now I'm really, you know, definitely cruising in style here at the con. But if you're looking for that awesome, memorable shot, here's a good spot for one right here. And this is in the lounge, which is accessible, like I said, through the hotel lobby, through the portal. Don't be afraid to check out these cool little places. And I believe, like I said, coming up next, we should have the Introduction to Anatomy panel. Jump into the Discord, definitely join that, and learn how to draw. I think I should join that because, you know, I don't think my essence of a cat really resembles a cat too much. I'll let the viewers decide on that one. All right, well, anyways, thank you everyone for tuning in and spending some time with me. Stick around and don't forget to join into the Introduction of Anatomy. Thanks everyone, have a great night.
Welcome everyone to Furnal Equinox. Bienvenue tout le monde à Furnal Equinox. I am Higglypoo, the convention chair for this event.
And I am Cloud. I am producing the stream for this event.
And we hope that you're having as good a time as we are.
And we just want to thank you all for blowing past all of our donation goals. And let's continue. Let's break that meter.
It's also free. Bring all your
free.
friends.
Bring
Let's
all your
beat
friends.
all the records.
Everybody out there, tell your friends. Tell your friends.
To come. Tell your friends to come.
Tell them to tell their friends.
Badgie, tell your friends. Better tell your friends. Badgie, come and tell them to tell their friends.
Badgie, tell them to tell their friends.
We want to thank you all for your donations.
Dark and moonless night has never felt so right. An empty mirror only shows what's left inside.
She don't care, we like almost there, the right vibe, ready to get live, ain't no surprise, take me so high, jumping those dives, surfing the crowd, ooh, said I gotta be the man, I'm the head of my band, mic check 1, 2, shut them down in the club when the Playboy does, till they all get loose, out the bottle, we all get pit in again tomorrow, gotta break rules, cause that's the motto, gun shut down 100 supermodels.
Hey, I heard you were a wild one.
Gentlemen, we can rebuild him. We have the technology.
This is the end station.
Hi, welcome to my panel, the Anatomy Basics panel. My name is Syrian, and over the course of the next hour, we're going to go through the basics of anatomy, musculature, the mechanics of it, some things to keep in mind, some of the shapes that you'll see as an artist, just a whole bunch of things to keep in mind that I've picked up over the years. My background is that I am an medical laboratory technologist. Right now I'm just drawing. My specialty is in exaggerated figures, so bear that in mind. I'm going to be coming at this from someone who tends to do a fair bit of superhero type anatomy, so that may inform some of the things that I'm going to be relaying. So without further ado, let's get to it. So why learn anatomy? First off is, why not? As artists, we tend to be learning constantly. We're always picking things up. We're always trying to find new ways to do things. And anatomy is one of those fundamental things that I think just about every artist should know, should be familiar with. You may not need to know all the specifics, but having as much of an understanding as possible is something that you can definitely bring to your work. Everything needs structure, whether that's buildings, whether that's people. Having a solid structure to build from will translate to your poses, will translate to your gestures. It'll inform a lot of what you do, and having a solid understanding of that structure means that you can take it and twist it and exaggerate it as needed in order to bring things across without having it be something that sticks out as being fabricated or incorrect. And that's a major thing, that the more you know, the less you need to make up. So the more solid your anatomy grounding, the less that you have to rely on your viewer to forgive. The better the anatomy, it's one less thing that the person looking at your picture will have to really think about or worry about. It's just one less thing there that means that there's one less thing between you and the viewer. And also what you do make up becomes solidly grounded in reality the better your anatomy knowledge. If you're starting to hybridize things, then knowing the anatomy that you're replacing, knowing the anatomy that you're going to be replacing it with, those are very important. And again, it comes across as one less thing for your viewer to have to really worry about it. It increases the believability of it. So what I'm going to be covering is just a basic overview of the skeleton. I may not be going into every bone, every muscle, but we are going to be doing a basic overview of the skeleton, a basic overview of body mechanics, basically how the body works, how the body moves. We'll be doing the major surface muscles, which are most of the shapes that you'll be accustomed to, or that you'll become accustomed to in drawing your figure, in showing off the body. I'll cover a bit on hands and feet just because they've been problem areas for me, so I guess that a lot of other artists would have these as problem areas too. So we're going to go over those lightly just to kind of give you a better idea of how they are, what they work, or how they work. And hopefully that should be good for folks, as well as hybridization. This is the furry fandom. Hybridization is kind of part and parcel of what we do. So I'll be just taking a kind of high-level overview of things so that we can just kind of get an idea of how to bring anatomy into that. What I won't be covering, I won't be doing faces. There are a lot of muscles. There's a lot to think about with the face, but I tend to think of that almost more as a gesture, pose, expression type thing. And that isn't really the nature of what I want this talk to be about. Again, with gestures, we're not going to be covering those just because that's more about how to use it than what is anatomy. And organs and internal structures, we're not going to be doing those. I mean, that for certain artists and for certain pieces, that may be helpful to know. But again, this is more of an introductory lesson, so we won't be getting into those today. Okay, so the skeleton. It is not important to know every bone here, but we are going to go over a fair number of them. So there's about 300 bones in the body, but we'll mostly cover the large ones. So you have the skull, the mandible, which is your jaw. You have the spinal column, which are made up of vertebrae. There are 3 zones that we usually consider. You have the cervical vertebrae, which are the ones that are in the neck, the thoracic vertebrae, which are the ones that are around the rib cage, and the lumbar vertebrae, which are the ones in the lower back down to the hips. Now, there's some extra bones there that are called the sacrum and the coccyx. The sacrum is a set of fused bones that make up essentially our tailbone along with the coccyx. In a animal with a tail, those vertebrae would not be fused, and they would actually make the structure of the tail itself go right down to the end. Then you have the clavicles, which are the collarbones, scapula, which is the bone that makes up your wing bones here in the shoulder and are important to the actual shoulder socket. You have the sternum, which is the bony plate that's right in the middle of your chest that all of the costals or the ribs all attach to. So they attach to that as well as in the back to the spine. And then you have the arm. So you have the bone of the upper arm, which is the humerus. It's bent at the neck, right up at the top. It affects its range of motion. So bear that in mind. It is not a straight bone. It kind of has a bit of a hockey stick shape to it. Then you have the 2 bones in the forearm, the radius and the ulna. These are a little interesting in that they rotate over each other in order to pronate and supinate the wrist. So that informs a lot of the muscles that attach there. It makes it particularly interesting the way that they interact when they do so. Then you have the hands, which are made up of 3 sets of muscles. You have the carpals, which are the actual muscles in the wrist itself. You have the metacarpals, which are the ones in the palm of the hand. Then you have the phalanges, which are the actual fingers. And that'll be mirrored down in the foot. So then you have the legs, which are the femur, which is the major bone of the upper thigh. Much like the humerus, it is bent at the neck, and that affects its range of motion. That affects how everything attaches. Patella is the actual knee itself, not a bone of the knee. The patella is a floating bone on top of that joint. Then you have the tibia and the fibula. Those are the bones of the shin. Tibia being the major one, the fibula is a smaller, much thinner bone, and they both make up the actual bony protrusions of the ankle and are part of the hinge joint that is the foot. And then when you actually get down to the foot itself, much like the hands, you have the tarsals, which are the bones of the ankle, the metatarsals, which are the bones of the arch of the foot, and the phalanges, which are the actual toes. There's also the calcaneus, which is the heel, which is also where the Achilles tendon attaches. So that's important there too. So far as joints, there are multiple types of joints. For the most part, you're interested in ball and socket which are the shoulder joints and the hip joints. Then you have plane joints, which are like the knee, where it's essentially two flat or very kind of rounded surfaces that rub off each other. Some of the costal joints, where the ribs meet the sternum, are like that as well. Then you have hinge joints like the elbow and like the ankle, which are basically a single point that bones rotate around. That's kind of your main joint types. And yeah, let's move on. So the basics of what muscle is muscle is linear actuators, if you want to use a more machinery concept. Muscles pull, so they pull from one point to another. The muscle that we're largely concerned with is what's called striated muscle, which are those linear fibers, and because they work in one direction and they're oriented in one direction, that gives it a striated appearance. There are a couple other types, but they tend to be either organs or internal. Now, muscles always act across a joint. The whole point of a muscle is that it is pulling something and making something bend. So oftentimes you'll see a bone that will either bridge one or two joints, and you always have to think of it in that manner. Muscles can't push, so they tend to act in antagonistic pairs, where you have one that will pull in one direction, one that will pull in another, and sometimes more that will pull in other directions as well. And they counterbalance each other, and they allow for movement along multiple axes. Another point that's good to know is that muscles attach via tendons, and the tendons are structures that do not have any ability to stretch or really conform. They can bend to an extent, but think of them mostly as a rigid structure. And because of that, you will have situations where muscles will overlap in such a way that it's mostly the tendons doing the overlapping, so that way they're not really getting in the way of each other when they're actually performing their duties. In some cases, there are large areas of the body that have just bands of tendon. I'll be going into one of those in the back and one of those in the legs when we get to that part of the lecture. But bear that in mind. The muscles are attached by tendons, and they tend to move across joints. So we'll start with the chest. The main muscles here are your pectorals. They are really responsible for the kind of pulling the arms forward motion. The deltoids are your standard shoulder muscles. So these have three heads. They have an anterior, a median, and a posterior head. And they are responsible for elevating the arm. They actually attach to a little protrusion on the outside of the upper arm and pull the arm up. Trapezius is a muscle that you can see it from the front, but it is mostly a back muscle. But that is responsible more for a kind of lifting, shrugging motion. The lats, latissimus dorsi, those are muscles that tend to form kind of the cowl structure on the side of a person. They attach about halfway down the back down to the iliac joint of the spine. And that's responsible more for pulling downward and pulling back. The abdominals are the core. Everybody is familiar with a 6 or an 8 pack. There are three smaller bands that start just below the pectorals and run down to about the navel area. Then there's a larger band that goes down to the groin. The obliques are stabilizing and rotational muscles that flank the abdominals, and they are responsible for turning. And a muscle set that is something that I tend to use a lot, especially considering the exaggerated anatomy I tend to use, are the sternocleidomastoids. They're the V of muscles that's formed here between the jaw and the clavicle. And that can be a nice shape to show off, especially for someone who's a little more ripped or built. That can be a nice shape to show. The anterior arm, so the front aspect of it, we have teres minor, which is a muscle in here that is responsible for pulling the arm down, a bit of stabilization as well. Serratus anterior, which is a feathered muscle that is in this area of the body. it tends to go between latissimus dorsi and the ribs, the costals. So that gives it that feathered look to it. It's got a kind of a ridge that can, in certain characters, that can be a shape to show off. Biceps brachii, just about everybody is familiar with biceps. It's called brachii because it's branched. It has one termination point that's right in the pit of the arm. And then there are two attachment points that are higher up in the shoulder. And it's mostly responsible for the bicep flex type of idea. It's more so for pulling the forearm up. Triceps brachii is the triceps, back of the arm. Same thing, it is a branched muscle, so it has 3 heads. We'll go into that in a little bit later, but it is a muscle that is very important. It tends to pull the elbow out. It anchors and then pulls the elbow out. Brachialis is a muscle that's underneath those. It's responsible for some stabilization and a bit of the elbow movement. Brachioradialis, this is one that starts on the outside of the arm and comes around and attaches about halfway down underneath the thumb. That one is responsible for turning the wrist over. So that is a fairly large muscle that, again, it's a very large shape that is something that you can show. It also tends to be important to know how it tends to fold, just because since it crosses a joint and the elbow joint is fairly complex with the amount of muscles around it, that can be very important to show in foreshortening. Now we're also going to start getting to some of the longer names. Extensor carpi radialis longinus, which is a muscle that runs from right about the elbow and is responsible for, it's an extensor, it's responsible for opening some of the fingers of the hand. You have the flexor pack, which is a series of 4 or 5 muscles that are on the wrist aspect. They tend to travel through the carpal tunnel. We'll cover what that is later. And they are responsible for flexing, for closing the hand. Then there's pronator teres, which you don't tend to see a whole lot, but it is important to know what it is. Because the bones of the forearm is 2 bones, that's responsible for both keeping them together and for some of the turning motion of them. All right, so now we'll move on to the posterior arm, so the back aspect of the arm. We start off with infraspinatus, which is one of the muscles on the scapula that attaches to the actual shoulder itself. Then you have teres major, which is the other half of teres minor, which we saw in the armpit. This one attaches to the scapula and comes around to the outside part of the arm. Now we can finally see the 3 heads of triceps brachii. So we have the long head, the lateral head, and the medial head. The outside of the arm has the lateral head. It's basically a single mass. It runs from underneath the deltoid down to the elbow. And then the inside of the arm is where we have the long head, which is the upper part, and the medial head, which is the part down near the elbow. It splits about halfway down, and they are all involved in that extending motion. Then we have anconeus, which is a muscle that wraps around the elbow. We have brachioradialis again, because it is basically visible from both sides. And we have the next 4 are all part of what I call the extensor group. So they are this kind of mass in the middle of the forearm. You don't necessarily need to know or show them all. They won't really stand out except for extreme motions or an extreme physique. But it is helpful to know because when you're drawing the forearm, you can tend to deal with it as 3 areas. So you have brachioradialis, the extensor group, and the flexor group. So the flexor group are the ones down here. And by drawing the interaction of those 3, that's typically the easiest way to really conceptualize how the forearm is going to move. And we also have flexicarpi ulnaris, which is one of the muscles here on the back of the arm. Runs through the ulnar groove, which is this depression that you can usually feel. It feels like almost like you're just touching bone on the aspect of the hand along with the pinky. All right, moving on to the back. So major structures in the back, we have the trapezius. Just about everybody is familiar with a good large set of traps. Starts about in the middle of the back and runs up to the neck. Runs out both sides along the back of the shoulders. Tends to form a nice kind of triangle shape that you can see from the front. It's a lot of the muscles in the back are really involved in spinal motion. So they stabilize, they roll, they are made for movement. So mostly you're going to want to know their general shapes and where they attach. And then as you move the body, you'll deform them. The deltoids, as again, you normally see the posterior heads, which attach along with trapezius, and they mesh in with some of the lower muscles because we have infraspinatus and teres major here again. Those are kind of the wing muscles around the scapulas. Latissimus dorsi is back as well. Here you can see in light blue where the tendinous part of it comes right down to the rump. And then you have the actual muscular part, which is in yellow, and that's the part that wraps around and actually comes up to the inside of the arms. Depending on the physique, you may be able to see the external obliques, which are part of that oblique pack. They are the outside extremities of them, so those are rotational and stabilizing muscles. And then we have gluteus medius and gluteus maximus. Glutes, the backside. Both of those run down to the upper part of the femur, which is the uppermost bone in your thigh. And they pull on it in slightly different ways. Maximus actually rides on top of medius, and they both accomplish basically the same type of motion. They pull the leg basically out to the back and up. And the glutes are a good example, actually, of muscles that are riding on top of each other. Medius is a little less superficial than maximus. And also when you're drawing the two, there is a small kind of indent along the top that kind of runs along the edge of maximus and medius. That can be important to show when you're doing a backside. All right, now the legs. There are a lot of muscles in the legs. For the large part, you don't need to show everything, but there are some major shapes that you really should know in the leg. Everybody will recall that the front of the legs are your quads, the back of your legs are your hamstrings. So rectus femoris and vastus medialis, they all basically attach on the crest of the iliac bone, which is your hip bone in the front. Rectus femoris runs down the center, so it's strictly in the, it pulls in the frontal direction, pulls it up. Lateralis attaches on the outsides of the knee, responsible for pulling kind of on an angle. Medialis attaches underneath a few. There are a bunch of muscles that run over it, but it is responsible for pulling the leg up and in. Tensor fascia lata is a lot like the large band on latissimus dorsi in the back. It's just a strip of fascia, of tendon, but it is a rather large piece, and it divides a couple of muscles that run down the side of the leg. So you need to know it more so because it's a void of muscle as opposed to a muscle itself. Iliopsoas is, along with pectineus, which is actually not in order, those are two of the muscles that are in the groin region. They pull the thigh kind of in. Sartorius is a muscle that is fairly pretty, actually. It crosses the leg, so it actually starts on the iliac crest with rectus femoris and vastus lateralis, but it crosses over the leg and attaches on the inside of the knee. So that one is responsible for a lot of turning in the leg, and it's a very prominent structure. You'll see that on a lot of folk at various levels of physique, that this muscle is usually, if not visible, at least feelable. Then we have adductor longus, which is down into the shin. So this one's involved in ankle movement. Gracilis, which is on the inside of the thigh, kind of runs from the inside of the groin down, attaches in almost the same place as sartorius, so it pulls the legs in and together. Tibialis anterior is one of the front muscles in the shin. The shin is largely a bony structure that you can show when you're drawing the shins, but tibialis is kind of the major muscle that you can see running across the front. It tends to run diagonally from the outside of the knee and then runs down to the middle or the inside of the ankle. Extensor digitorum longus is one of the muscles that it actually runs next to tib anterior. That one is involved in extending the toes. Usually you can just kind of show them as one structure or a small division in between them. Peroneus longus is, again, on the outside of the shin. That one is more stabilization of the ankle. Then we have the gastrocnemius and soleus muscles, which collectively are the calves. Gastroc sits on top of soleus, and they are responsible for the Achilles tendon to the heel. So they are multiple-headed muscles. They attach on both sides of the knee in the back and pull on the Achilles tendon. You can get a better view of that here on the posterior leg slide. So posterior leg, so now the back part of the leg, we're talking about the hamstrings. So you have biceps femoris, which is the main hamstring pack is two muscles, and one attaches on the outside of the knee, one attaches on the inside of the knee. Biceps femoris is the one that attaches on the outside. Semitendinous is the one that attaches on the inside. They both run from basically right underneath the glutes and terminate on the backside of the knee of the lower limb. Adductor magnus is one of the muscles that's responsible for pulling the leg back and in. So that one forms kind of the inside of the thigh on the back. Gracilis is one of the muscles on the inner thigh. Again, sartorius you can see here just because of where it wraps around the leg, where it attaches. Semimembranous is one that is underneath the hamstrings. Sometimes you can see it, sometimes you can't, but it is helpful to know that semitendinous basically runs on top of it. Then you have the iliotibial tract, which is a lot like the tensor fascia lata. It's basically a void in between some muscles with fascia and tendon. Because it makes a prominent shape, it's good to know it's there, but it isn't a muscle in the true sense. We have gastrocnemius again. We have plantaris, which is a muscle in behind the knee. It's involved in rotation of the two muscles of the lower leg, the tibia and the fibula. Soleus is there. Extensor digitorum longus, again, one of the muscles that's involved in extending the toes, and peroneus is ankle stabilization again. So with the leg, there are a lot of shapes that will show on folks of various structures. So knowing these is important. Also important is that, we'll be getting into it in a couple more slides, once we start talking about digitigrade legs, adjusting some of your leg anatomy is something that is important, and you'll be playing with this a lot if you do have digitigrade characters that you draw. So let's talk about the hands. When you're talking about the hands, it's more important to know tendons and bones than muscle, because most of what you see is as a response of tendon and bone. Now, there are a few muscles that are rather important to know. We'll get to those in a minute. But all of the extensor pack run over the back of the wrist. So sometimes you can see those depending on flexion. Those are usually responsible for the ridges that you can see on the back of the hand most often. The flexor muscles all run through the carpal tunnel. So what the carpal tunnel is a void between some of the bones in the wrist. And the tendons of the flexor pack run through that along with some nerves. Hence carpal tunnel syndrome. If those tendons become inflamed, it can put pressure on the nerves, and that is one reason why we really do need to take care of our wrists, because that is a hard limitation for a lot of people if solving carpal tunnel syndrome involves actually cutting one of the ligaments that holds everything in. It's a little messy. So the muscles that I think are important in the hand for drawing it, you've got opponens digiti minimi, which forms the kind of the meaty part of the hand underneath the pinky. Then you have adductor pollicis brevis, which is the lower part of the thumb, the heel of the hand underneath the palm. So that's involved in pulling it back. Flexor pollicis longinus, which is another part. It's in here, and that's for pulling it. And then adductor, which is kind of more the side-to-side motion of the thumb, and that's in kind of in the webbing of the hand. One thing with the slide I did here is that my character has only 3 fingers. So when you're dealing with a character with less or even more digits, sometimes it can be helpful to kind of consider some digits as being melded, which is how I did here. Basically the middle 2 digits I treat as 1 for drawing a 3-fingered person. And adjust that as needed. But this is where we're starting to get to some of the fabrication and knowing the way that a normal body functions, and then adjusting that in order to fit the character. Feet. So much like the hands, there's not a whole lot of muscles in the foot to really worry about, but there is a lot of fascia. There is some structures to really kind of know. When you're dealing with the foot, because it is just a bunch of plain joints, it doesn't have a whole lot of articulation as per se. So you kind of treat it as the rounded area that's the heel. You have the kind of wedge area that forms the arch of the foot, and then more of a flattened area that is the ball of the foot underneath the toes. And you kind of treat it as those 3 shapes and how those 3 shapes move, instead of kind of approaching it from a multi-bone standpoint. The foot and the ankle really are restricted to mostly vertical movement. There is some slight lateral, but it is mostly vertical, and some rolling. Because of the way the ankle is shaped, it's easier to roll the feet in than it is to roll the feet out. Rolling the feet out is responsible for a very painful fracture of the fibula. Rolling the feet in is more of a sprain situation. So always be mindful of that if you're drawing someone with their feet tilted or on an uneven surface, that you can tilt it in, that works okay, it can look uncomfortable, but tilting it out tends to look like something's broken. So hips. A large part of the hips is knowing kind of where the crest of the hip is, the iliac arch. And a lot of the muscles in the front of the leg attach there. A lot of the muscles in the back attach on the rear, the glutes, attach on the rear part of that crest. So The pelvic cradle is essentially a large hollow object. A lot of our organs are inside it. It's a protective mechanism. But the way that the thighs work is that it's a ball and socket joint. The femur is actually slightly bent. There's a kind of a bend in the neck of it up near the top. And because of that, moving the hips kind of has an inherent range of motion problem. Because if you just lift them straight out to the sides, at some point it will attempt to pop them out of socket. So if you're trying to get more range of motion, a lot of people will have seen this with any kind of gymnast, is that they'll tend to rotate the thigh in order to get a little more flexion out of it. So if you're really going for a splits type of pose, you're going to have to rotate the thigh in order to do that. So sometimes knowing the mechanics kind of can lead you to the adjustments that you have to make to a pose in order to make it look natural and comfortable. Okay, so let's move on to animal anatomy. I'm not going to go too deep into it. It's mostly just kind of a really quick overview. Animal anatomy tends to be largely analogous to human anatomy. There are some things that are wildly different, but for the most part, most of the structures that you're going to draw, you can tend to think of them as modified versions of human anatomy. So a lot of the same muscles and muscle groups, a lot of the same bones, and a lot of the same arrangements. The illustration on this slide is the fore and hind limb of a canine. And you can see that, for the most part, you can see the muscles that make up what would effectively be the wrist. You can see the muscles that are the bones that would make the wrist. You can see the bones that would make up the carpals, the bones in the middle of the hand. You can see the fingers. And they're just in a different way, and part of the way that they're put together, the tendons, the muscles involved, is to allow them to function basically by walking on fingertips. And knowing that can give you some things when you start to hybridize as well. And a lot of, when you start to hybridize, knowing the anatomy that you are replacing with, or knowing the anatomy that you're modifying, can really inform some of the decisions that you make in how to put things together and how to make things move. Such as digitigrade legs. You're basically going to be replacing the ankle with a different structure. Since you're replacing the ankle, you're going to be changing up the calves. You may need to actually shorten the calves. Because the knee is going to be basically permanently bent at a certain point. You may need to adjust the way that your thigh muscles work. So that's something to consider. When you start considering a tail, that's going to adjust the muscles of the back. It's going to adjust the muscles of the rump. That's going to tie into things. And that's something to consider. When you start thinking about wings, wings will need their own sockets. They'll need their own muscles. I mean, they are load-bearing. If you're making wings that are going to be carrying a person, they have to be able to do that. And let's talk about wings. So wings are modified arms. That's strictly what they are. They have largely the same bone structure. They have fingers once you start looking at it. Whether that's a bat, where you can very clearly see the same structures, you can clearly see the fingers. Basically, it's just webbing between them. Even if you're looking at a bird, the pinions, they all actually fit in with the structure, the bony structure. So think of them as hands, and that can give you some idea of what to do with them too. Wings don't just have to be something that hang off the character's back. They can gesture, they can hold things, they can be used. Work them in. They are limbs. So use them as you would any other limb. In my case, where I tend to deal with very muscled characters, if someone wouldn't skip leg day or wouldn't skip arm day, why would they skip wing day? The structures there, why would they not work those out as well? I mean, why would you have small wings on someone who, 300 or 400 pounds of muscle. Like, why not? Really, something else to work on, something else to kind of give it a bit of verisimilitude. Now, let's strictly talk about hybridization for a minute. I tend to think of hybridization as falling somewhere on a spectrum that you can really kind of put into 3 stages. You have minimal changes, so things that are just superficial or require like very small changes. Think like Neko-chan ears, regular hands but with claw tips, paw pads, things of that nature that you can kind of tack on without having to adjust other things to compensate for that. Then you have more hybridized anatomy where you really have to start adapting and modifying, and in some cases extrapolating. When you start to push things together, you have to figure out either a way for them to knit or a way to trade off between them. The slide here is one of my friends, Belina, who is part wolf, part cow. So you get some interesting things there, like the hind limbs. So those are kind of wolf paws, but we went with having more ungulate hoof type digits. One of their arms is a regular human forearm, but ends in a dog paw. So having to adjust for that. Facial structures, horns, cow ears on a canine face, things of that nature, where you just kind of have to decide, okay, are we going to have things that are kind of halfway between, or are we going to mix and match? I also consider tails really to be something that are hybrid anatomy, because you're starting to really have to pull from other sources and find ways to knit things together. And digitigrade legs are definitely something that are hybrid. They require that kind of modification. Feral style muzzles, when you're trying to get facial expression in, but a feral style muzzle doesn't have all the same movement that a human face does. So sometimes you have to make concessions in order to be able to get a facial expression. A lot of Disney movies and DreamWorks movies can be really good to kind of look at and to see different ways to approach that. And then you have the other end, which is fantasy. So this is where we are in extreme revisions, things that don't really have a real world example that you can pull from, where you're having to really consider, okay, let's draw a line in the sand. Let's figure out, okay, this can't happen, but how can we bring it as close to being plausible as possible? Where you're outright fabricating things now. So think of like a tour. There is really no way for you to find a real world example where you have basically a hip structure that intersects with a collarbone structure. So how are you going to approach that? Where are your muscles going to attach? How does it bend across that joint? Things like that you have to consider. When you have a dragon character like mine is, who has wings as well as arms, so now you have 4 arm sockets, how does that affect their musculature? So latissimus dorsi, do you have a duplicate set? Do you have a branched nature where it's one terminus on the back, but it pulls on both limbs? Here we have a slide of my mate Dern, and just showing some underarm of a wing and a shoulder. So that can be something to really consider, is how do you put these structures in and make them usable? As well as multiple limbs, that can make some big decisions that you have to do, such as, are you just going to add another set of scapula to the back? Are you going to duplicate the entire collarbone structure and move it up? How are you going to approach that? And each way that you do that requires different concessions and requires different types of fabrication. So here it is really important to know the anatomy you're replacing and what you're replacing it with, because if it's wrong, it's just going to make everything harder. And in making it harder, it makes it harder to sell it as well. You can oftentimes see someone who just kind of slapped wings on a character. And once you get used to, really kind of trying to work it in, wings that are just there, they become a distraction. And you really would like to see someone take the time to knit it into the character. So believable hybridization really requires you to have recognizable elements and put them together in a way where it looks plausible. We oftentimes don't have real world examples for a lot of this, so some of it is rule of cool. If it looks cool and it looks good, people will forgive a lot. But for the most part, you're just trying to make it plausible. A lot of the time you can't make it correct because there is no real world example to gauge this against. You only have the ability to make it look feasible. And last thing we're going to talk about is tails, just because I've brought that up a few times. Adding a tail to a character, now I tend to think more so in the lines of a dragon tail because that's what I work with a lot, as well as it's one of the more extreme examples of adding a tail because of the size of it and the musculature involved. So a tail, when I started looking at how to put one together, I looked at the actual structure of an alligator tail. That's the cross section, essentially, is that you have a set of muscles on the back of it that, pull the tail up, pull the tail to the sides. You have this set of muscles on the bottom that aid in side-to-side movement, aid in bending it. So those muscles, that goes all the way up. So you tend to have, a divot on the sides where the two packs come together, a divot on the back where those packs come together. All of those muscles on the back that lift the tail up, well, that has to happen across the hip joint. So where's that going to knit into the back? I'll usually have them knit into the bottom part of latissimus dorsi, and then they'll have other parts that basically knit onto the back of the iliac crest next to the glutes. How does it interact with the glutes? So the glutes are pushing up against the side of it. Now you've got another division plane, and you have to that's creating a new shape. How's that going to affect how the hips work? You have a tail that's roughly as wide as someone's hips. Well, that's going to adjust, the width of their hips. That's going to adjust their gait is going to have to accommodate it. A tail is a large amount of mass. How's that going to affect their walk cycle? It's going to have a sine motion, left to right. So that's going to pull the hips left to right. Pulling the hips left to right is going to make the upper body rock, and you end up with the entire motion of the character is changed because of the tail. So it is a natural continuation of the spine. Don't bend it like like a hard 90-degree bend in a tail is a broken tail. So keep that in mind. It is still a structure that you have to be careful with. You have to bend, and don't bend it too quickly or too much. But yes, keep in mind that there are oftentimes real-world examples that you can pull from. It's just having then to go and extrapolate, okay, well, how is this going to mesh with what I want to attach it to? And that's kind of where a lot of furry anatomy kind of ends up, is picking and choosing these pieces that are disparate and that don't have a real world example of how they come together, and finding a way to put them together and to make it believable, to make it something that you can look at and go, if it were possible, it'd look like that. And every time you can do that, every time you can kind of give somebody something else to think about, like I've added in, muscular wings for folks that haven't really considered it before, or gestured with wings or tails and you can show somebody the poses and motions and shapes that their character can make strictly because they are so special, simply because you've added this, and work it into the character. make it part of the character. This is their body. They've been living in it for years. They'd be comfortable with using it in different ways. And show that off. That's part of showing off a character, is show what they can do and not just who they are. So that's everything for tonight. Thank you very much for coming and spending an hour here with us, listening to my lecture. If you have any questions or feedback, please let me know. You can find me at syrian@gmail.com. That's my email. You can also find me on Twitter, at Syrian. That tends to be the best way to keep in contact with me. So hopefully next year, if FE is back in physical space, I should be doing panels there again. So in the meantime, take care. Thank you for coming. Be safe, wash your hands, and we'll see you next year. Bye.